Hi everyone. Today we have a recording of the meeting I had with Remmelt Ellen, one of the two individuals who runs the AI Safety Camp, aka AISC, about my proposal for a research project for the upcoming instance. The entire conversation is centered around my research proposal document, which both of us had access to. For viewers, I have linked a copy of the document, which mirrors the research proposal at the time of this recording, in the show notes. I will hop back in for a few more asides throughout the episode, and all articles mentioned in these asides can also be found in the show notes. Because I'm not used to this whole process yet, I didn't have Remmelt introduce himself, and my initial question was worded so ineloquently that I decided to just cut it and instead provide context for Remmelt's initial statements here. He began by giving his general thoughts on the proposal as a whole, and any questions or concerns that would need to be resolved before drilling into specific details.
So I feel like partly I'm still kind of unsure about the bigger argument around like bioengineered pandemic risks and how machine learning will be used there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure that's partly me just lacking technical expertise here, but it's a bit of a question like, okay, so there's naive questions or something around like, hey, why would you expect large language models to kind of train on stuff on the internet to suddenly like pick up on how to bioengineer pathogens or for you to be able
Yes.
to use it in that way? That's something I've been wondering.
So there are two different aspects here that I think are relevant. So the first is it's not, at least when I was thinking about this project, I'm not just referring to large language models because there was a specific model that was designed for drug discovery and
Yeah.
with a small tweak to it, basically, the team was able to do novel, like, poison discovery, basically. The model I am thinking of is Megasign, which debuted with the paper Megasign, integrating generative molecule design, automated analog designer, and synthetic viability prediction, published on September 30th of 2021 by Fabio Urbina et al. In March of 2022, Urbina et al. Released a new paper entitled Dual Use of Artificial Intelligence-Powered Drug Discovery for the SPIA's Convergence Conference. This paper demonstrated that their model generator could easily produce highly toxic chemical agents by simply rewarding predicted toxicity instead of penalizing it.
Yeah.
And so the idea is we're not just looking at large language models, but also other machine learning capabilities that are anywhere in that process of like what you would need to do to bioengineer a pandemic and like actually use that in an attack. Anything that is a significant way to circumvent the bottleneck that's currently there. And so that specific example would be a way to circumvent the like research and knowledge required bottleneck, because if you had access to this system, you wouldn't need to know anything about researching genes or anything like that. You would just be able to use it and it would generate what that thing looked like. I did not know this at the time, but Jonas Sandbrink released a paper distinguishing the difference between these two categories in August of 2023. He calls the tools that expand the capabilities of sophisticated actors biological design tools, or BDTs. The second part is even with LLMs, there is still a concern about reducing the barrier to entry for pandemics and like really any attack, because it significantly reduces the effort required by an actor.
And how would that work?
You can ask the model to say, like, how would you conduct a bioterrorist attack? And obviously, most models are not going to respond. But with adversarial attacks, and then also there's at least one model that I know of that would respond, you're going to get a high level summary that's relatively accurate, and that significantly reduces time input and knowledge required. And then you can drill into each of those different subtasks, and it basically helps you plan the process. And as LLMs get more sophisticated, they're going to be able to tell you in more detail what to do. to achieve that process. And so I don't know exactly what that looks like now as compared to what it would look like when I think things would be really dangerous. I don't think that with the current systems, it doesn't make it that much easier, but I think it does make it somewhat easier. And I think that just bringing attention to that in a quantitative way, ideally, would be important to lawmakers, because I don't think that they're necessarily thinking about it like that. And
It's
so,
kind of like some kind of planning process, a bit like asking the large language model to code something or to give you some to point you to some library or something like that. It can kind of
yes,
help you brainstorm or like put some kind of building steps together in terms of like how you might approach it.
yes. And there, but it can also give you like very specific, like, you need to have access to something that can, actually generate this, like put it together. Here is the kind of machinery that you would need, or like the type of technology you need for that. And that's just like where we're at right now. I think that can pretty easily get more sophisticated, because that's just going to be generalization, because it's not, when we're thinking about the planning portion and telling you like where to go and what to do, that's going to be primarily based on generalization and like extrapolation from information that it has been trained on. But then the part where it starts to get really scary is when the large language models have access to additional specific, like more narrow tools, like the one that I was talking about earlier. I could see a scenario where you can do autonomous creation of a pathogen. So the AI system knows how to run the machine, like the hardware required to do it. So now you don't have to know how to do that hardware. And you actually may not even have to have access to it if the system can gain access to it itself.
A lot of this reminds me just, you were also talking about toxins just before. It reminds me of like all the progress that has been made with chemical synthesis.
Yes.
And I'm just kind of wondering, like, hey, is there like some analog or like analogy for this that like, okay, yeah, that already works. There's this chem robot that learns how to synthesize chemicals. Is there some version of this with biology?
Part of the project is identifying what those like key capabilities are, and what things that have already happened we can use to inform our understanding of like what that actually looks like, and also inform our understanding of how that affects maybe ease of circumventing a certain bottleneck or barrier, and then use that information along with criminology. And so that's where like the accessibility of guns in various countries versus the corresponding number of mass shootings. I don't think that that is a good analog for like motivation, but I do think it's a good thing to use to inform access to technology versus use of that technology in harmful ways.
It's tricky though, because like I guess the motivation comes into play there, and maybe also something like, I guess there's a difference between having a gun and releasing some kind of modified virus.
Yes, and
Uh,
that's also like that was just an idea that I had when I was writing it. I don't necessarily need to follow that thread for multiple reasons. One of which is the info hazard risk of like, if we tie this to guns, could it polarize AI safety, which we definitely don't want to do. So as you're bringing up, maybe it's not the greatest parallel, and then also thinking about the info hazard, I'm thinking it might be better to not pursue this angle specifically.
I think maybe there are better analogies in terms of actual kind of chemical substances or like biochemical weapons that have been used and how much they've spread around. So I don't know whether you can tie that to it, but the use of anthrax or
Yeah. No, that's
yeah.
okay. So, like, the purpose of that specific question that I had written was, how do we understand how the accessibility of the technology affects the likelihood of it being used?
Yeah. I guess the problem is that there just haven't been that many cases of bioweapons having been used by non-state actors in the past.
Right. So I was trying to think of different weapons technologies that we could use as a grounding. Like here is how it worked in this case. And then the way that I got to guns specifically was we have a lot of data on that, and like
Mm,
we have a lot of countries that have varying rules. So it would be easy to say like, okay, the US has this amount of restriction and you can match that to the number of like mass shootings or just shootings in general or gun related deaths, and then you compare that to a different country that has significantly different
mm,
gun laws and compare those numbers. So the reason that I went to this
mm,
example
mm,
was just because of the breadth of
mm,
available information about it. But like I do
mm.
think that there are, yeah, it might not be the best angle to approach for multiple different reasons.
Oh yeah, another thing that I'm wondering about it is some combination of. So it starts out. I think you start out with talking about the motivation,
Mm-hmm.
and I really like your points here. By the way, like each of them resonated in terms of establishing a cutoff point.
Since I know that most likely you aren't currently looking at the doc, here is the portion that Remmelt is referencing. Currently, I believe that one of our utmost priorities in the field of AI safety should be to establish any form policy restricting the development and or deployment of dangerous ML systems. This is because we cannot trust companies or corporations to take a morally correct action when doing so does not align very closely with taking the financially optimal action. In most cases regarding AI, the financially optimal action is to move forward with development and deployment of increasingly advanced models. Because of the potential benefits of AI, there will be many opinions regarding what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed. Due to a large number of stakeholders, the bureaucracy of governments and standards agencies, and the highly polarized political climate that we are in, agreeing upon and establishing policy regarding AI cannot happen quickly. If we wait until there is an imminent threat to begin attempting to pass safety policies, there won't be enough time to establish those rules prior to the threat being realized. So, how can we increase the likelihood of getting restrictive policies in place?
I'm curious. I'm curious about like what the motivation here is. Is there some effort here to kind of restrict AI development in general, or more like in these specific areas that could potentially be like more, I don't know, risky at a massive scale? I'm curious how
So
you're thinking about that.
the initial thought here, so this came from I was talking with someone else, and they were like, "What are your strongest convictions in
Mm,
the space?" And like start there as a way to get some ideas generating. And I think my strongest conviction is that we need anything on the books at all that is somewhat restrictive. And that can be really, really broad, and we don't think we're going to reach it in a very long time. And that would be totally fine with me. It can be in the form of training, it can be in the form of
mm.
deployment, like whatever it is. I just want something because I think once we have it, it'll be a lot easier to so we can augment it or modify it as needed more easily, and we'll at least have something down.
Wait, is the idea there is if you have some kind of regulations around the restrictions of some parts of the AI pipeline, then you can probably extend it from there to include other things?
Yes, I think it would be easier to extend it from there than to create the legislation from the ground up. Basically, going down to the last statement I made, if we wait until there is an imminent threat to begin attempting to pass safety policies, there won't be enough time to establish those rules prior to the threat being realized. If we already have something in place, it's going to give us a pretty significant head start compared to that situation where we haven't even started. And potentially it will even like already somewhat address the threat. To contextualize this even more, the way that I got to this conclusion was in the AI governance course by Blue Dot Impact. They did like a little role playing thing where one person was the company that was going to be training a model that could do anything a human could do effectively. And there was like a summit or whatever where different stakeholders were coming together and voicing their opinions, and different people were being the different stakeholders. And I was the corporation in this case, and we went through the process. The different people had different perspectives, and I just sort of was like, yeah, but we'll do this thing that's good, or this thing. And then at the end of the time, no decisions had been made, which means that I won, I guess, by default, because there wasn't anything in place before, and because nothing happened, there was still nothing in place, and I could continue moving forward. So even though there were a couple great points brought up about like why we should regulate it, nothing actually happened. And so having something there so that we at least know like we're not going to allow someone to do something that most people agree is not something we want, like that would be very good to just have something down. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Some thinking here. Yeah, I think it does. Like the point about corporations, and somehow that feels very like I'm not in these lobbying circles or these kinds of circles, but it feels very realistic in terms of like what just happens if you just have a bunch of stakeholders together, and the corporations are going to like argue for like, hey, yeah, don't limit us too much, development, progress,
Right.
like whatever, and they're going to find all kinds of ways, and it just kind of get stuck where you actually need to restrict like development or deployment in harmful areas, that you just aren't able to reach that threshold, and you end up having kind of weird compromises or not enough actually happening to enforce restrictions or even existing laws. It feels right to me.
Going back to your initial question of like, what am I aiming for here? The idea was like there's a whole field of it, and governments are relatively in tune with biological like pandemic threats now thanks to COVID-19. I mean, it's obviously not good, like
Mm.
it could be much better, but at least people kind of understand what that threat is. That's part of it. The next part is everyone, I think except for one country or maybe two, is part of the ban on development, research, stockpiling, use of biological weapons and biological warfare. So everyone's already agreed, none of that, we don't want it. Because we have government agreement that like the governments aren't going to use bioweapons and do bioweapons research, there is no war games incentive like there is with nuclear weapons or maybe autonomous weapons of like, well, they have it, we have to do it as well, because we've already agreed no one has it. So if the governments don't have it, and that's part of what we're assuming in this project, is like we're not dealing with state actors. That is a whole different issue that we're not dealing with and hope is taken care of. Then the governments aren't going to want to let other people do this research. And that should be relatively easy to get agreement on. So if we can point to here are the things that are going to make it possible for this research to happen, and they are going to increase the likelihood of these events happening by X fold, then if it's significant enough, which I think it will be, because I think it's pretty hard not to have a significant increase when you're talking about X risk stuff, then we should be able to use that as evidence. And so this then goes to the policy portion of like, if we show this very explicitly, it seems that there really isn't an argument that you can make against having some form of cutoff. Like, you cannot release a model that will allow you to do bioweapons research, or like, you can't release it to the general public. You can't open source that model that does novel chemical compound discovery, because it could be used by a malicious actor very easily to do something bad. That's sort of the theory of change, I guess, of this project. And it does get a little fuzzy at that point where it switches from, okay, we have this really robust research piece in theory. We may not get there, but let's say that we do. We have this really robust research piece. At that point, we just sort of have to give it to the policymakers and then hope that it has traction. I have some connections in the Tech Congress policy fellowship that's being run. And I think also if we just publicize it, it might be enough to get public backing as well, because most people agree that like there is something to worry about with AI. And so I think if you quantify that in a way that is hard to disagree with, it's more likely to actually get something done.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I know some people who've been working on trying to get an AI Act kind of passed in the US. It seems like they're still in the early stages, so I'm not sure whether I should talk about it. But one of them was also talking about what I ended up calling the Catastrophic Misuse Prevention Act. So like preventing the misuse of technology that could lead to a catastrophe, including the development of technology, where the people are like, hey, well, this could lead to an extinction risk or something like that. But we're going to keep going because bad reasoning. Something that also comes to mind just from what you said before, it feels a bit like you were talking about two different angles. One is like, hey, you're going to have neural networks or other stuff trained on actual kind of biogenetic data of some kind that can actually be used to create novel pathogens or give predictive suggestions in terms of what kind of modifications to
Yes.
pathogens would make them more lethal or have a longer incubation period or something like that. That felt like one area, which is kind of involves the training on existing biogenetic data. And then there was this other category more broadly about large language models and other generative tools where your focus was on planning. And there I was actually thinking like in that case, it's not really just about bioweapons. It's just about any way that these tools can be used for planning or brainstorming of some kind that could give people interesting ideas, which makes it easier for them or encourages them to start trying out things that could be harmful at a systemic level.
My thought on reducing it to biorisk was basically just to give it like a very specific context, choosing the one that I thought would have the most capacity for traction. But I would agree with you, it's not just an issue for this specific category of risks.
Yeah. What I like about thinking about it more broadly that way is you could start with the biological planning process in mind and then say like, hey, this is in some ways just a kind of a case study or an example of something that could be also deployed all these other areas. So one thing I'm a little concerned about is if I'm thinking about companies like Anthropic, particularly talking about bioengineering risks, there is something about it that makes me wonder, like, why are they focusing on that in particular? And a concern I have is that they kind of find a niche thing where they're like, okay, here's a niche thing. We need to like all focus on that in a way where they don't actually have to stop developing their existing models. Something like, hey, we'll include something to prevent that in our models, or, we'll keep an eye on that because it's kind of a vague risk, particularly when you start talking about the large language models instead of like targeted use of machine learning techniques. So I think that there's a concern I have there that maybe the way that narrative could get used and likely will get used is in a way that these companies can keep scaling. And I kind of just want it to not be used in that way, to not become something that you kind of talk about with policymakers that in the end gets the policymakers kind of move away from restricting these companies from scaling up the training and use of their systems. How do you think about that?
No, yeah, that's a really good point. That's an angle that I hadn't really been thinking about. So my first thought, and I guess the one from just reading the comment, because I'd read it before, but then you explaining it sort of gave me a different perspective on it. Like, I guess response to the comment and my initial thoughts were that regardless of the different ways that companies that are paying attention to safety, they at least are, in theory, saying we want to keep things safe, and I think are putting some significant amount of resources towards that, and I think that they're doing okay. But regardless of the roadblocks that you put in place, so far at least, we've been able to break those roadblocks and to get past them through adversarial attacks or other methods.
With adversarial attacks, you mean like prompt engineering in ways to...
Prompt engineering, and also I'm specifically thinking of the paper that was published about how you could put an adversarial prefix before your question.
Oh, yeah.
That was just like a random, it seemed to be a random string of characters, but it actually, just completely circumvented the safety checks. Yeah. So I think that can be used as proof, as like, so far it seems that we can get around these relatively easily, even if it's just through prompt engineering, but more explicitly this paper that showed that you could create an adversarial prefix that just completely mitigated that safety. And additionally, fine-tuning models away from safety seems to be relatively easy. And then the third being that some companies are not doing what Anthropic's doing and have released their system completely open source, no barriers whatsoever. So yes, Anthropic's doing something that's better, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate it for the people who aren't. I guess that's sort of my thought on the initial thing. But then when you brought up, what about this being used as a justification to allow for more scaling and to basically use this as a way to say, oh, but we are doing this, so we are allowed to scale more.
Yeah.
And I think that's like definitely a reasonable concern. And so I'm trying to think about that. So maybe this isn't necessarily your stance on it, but I'll say what I'm thinking and we'll see how it comes out, and I might adjust it. If a company like Anthropic could show that they were addressing these risks to a certain extent, and by that I mean like fully, and we had a way of proving that, for example, one of the things that I wanted to investigate was different levels of access for a given type of technology. So the barrier to entry for novel chemical compound research that produces poisons and other things like that, even though we have a machine learning system that can do that, the barrier is still very much there because it's very restricted. Obviously, it's not as much there as it was before we had the system, but it is still very restricted, so it's not like we're giving access to everyone.
Not only that, I think the issue there, maybe in part, is just it's not like there aren't a huge number of toxins already well known when it comes to chemicals.
Yes.
So it's like, hey, how much on the margin are you going to contribute by coming up with another killer toxin?
Yeah, that's also true. So the thought was, like, because it's restricted, it's not actually decreasing that barrier by a ton, because you need to have permissions in order to access it, to actually be able to use it in a malicious manner. That argument could somewhat be extended to machine learning, and so, like, if there was a capability that we had established was highly likely to increase biorisk, that you can't deploy that to everyone, or you can't open source that model that can do that. And that alone would be better than what we have. And even if initially that allowed for a company that could very clearly demonstrate that they were being safe with their systems to scale more, that might be worth it. I don't know. That's my initial thought. What are your thoughts on that?
Good question. I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is that if there's this tendency for companies to identify these kind of far out things, or company leaders to identify these far out things to be addressed later, pulling it forward is useful. So if there's work showing that, like, hey, just currently with a cloud model, like if you use this string to kind of bypass it, you can just kind of talk with the chatbot and it can give some pretty useful suggestions in terms of where to start if you wanted to be a bioterrorist. Then it pulls it forward to the current models, where in a way that kind of from a comprehensive security perspective, it's like, hey, you're saying you're concerned about this, so can your current model actually, are you able to restrict these kind of planning processes, use of your model? And if the answer there is no, then it actually both dovetails the things that they've been pushing for. So it will be hypocritical of them to ignore what you're saying. And it shows that the current models are even not really up to the task. So if they're going to continue from here, it's going to be bad. So you can't do this. So from Anthropic's perspective, then also, like, from the responsible scaling policy approach that they're taking, they should also act.
They need to take a step back on the scaling and focus more on the security before they can continue to scale.
Yeah, somehow they need to prevent anyone from, like, doing planning for using technology in ways that could really harm other people. I mean, not even that. Like, if someone wants to plan a gun shooting,
right,
same thing. Yeah, and anything of that kind.
And I think that the parallel there, to me, that's interesting is China's regulations on their AI systems, because their AI systems cannot say anything bad about the CCP. And there was an instance where one of them did, like, through some sort of adversarial attack or something. Like, they were able to make it say something that was negative towards the CCP, and so it got taken down.
Oh, interesting.
I'm pretty positive. I definitely have heard that. I thought I read it. I'll have to look into that further. All right, so I did some digging, and it seems the story is slightly different than what I had thought, but the general ideas were right. As far as I can tell, I was remembering when Chinese regulators instructed tech giants Tencent Holdings and Ant Group to not offer access to ChatGPT via their platforms, resulting in many WeChat accounts being suspended. China Daily, one of the largest English print newspapers in China, made a post on Weibo stating that ChatGPT, quote, could provide a helping hand to the US government in its spread of disinformation and its manipulation of global narratives for its own geopolitical interests, end quote. This mentality seems to align with the Cyberspace Administration of China's, or CAC's, recent statement proposing a global artificial intelligence governance initiative on October 11th of 2023. Not only does this statement include information on the prohibition of content which violates socialist values, but it also details explicit guidelines for AI developers, including safety-relevant ones, and calls for international cooperation on AI governance. But to me, that's like, we should be doing that for X risks and for other risks like this. And so just trying to figure out a way to, like, actually convince people that that's worth doing. And that was the reason that I went to the bioterrorism angle.
Yeah.
So I guess then after what we've talked about and what your thoughts are, how does that shift maybe what this project is, or how could it shift what the project is to be more effective? Because I think there are definitely some things that we brought up here that sort of indicate that shifting it, not entirely, but shifting it a little bit could increase the impact.
Yeah, I think that my concern with these companies like Anthropic and OpenAI is that they seem to have a bit of a history of like pointing out in the future of like, that's something we need to, like, we want to be regulated on. And I just want to take their claims and say, okay, like, how does it apply to what you're doing now? And if it doesn't work for what you're doing now, then you should just stop what you're doing now. And basically just take their claims and reverse it back onto them. So that's one thought there. I think the way I've been thinking about AI development and how it could go really bad is it does basically involve these AI companies continuing to make profit through uses of their models and their AI infrastructure, using those profits to reinvest in more infrastructure, finding more ways to engineer and develop these models and larger systems for more general users. And then you just have that kind of feedback loop where over time they'll find new ways to automate human jobs and wrecking more money, which allows them to, like, whatever company keeps doing that, keeps finding ways to reinvest in ways to automate more work. That's my broad model. So in some way, that's what I have in the background here. It's like what I'm intending to block these AI companies with is that kind of feedback loop accelerating over time. From that perspective, I want to make sure that what they're saying is like somewhere out in the future, and we need to kind of like that gets redirected back at, okay, you're saying this is a risk, this is a problem. Okay, your current models aren't even like up to task or up to spec for handling that. Therefore, just by your own kind of concerns, that you shouldn't be doing this thing that you're doing. That's the kind of accountability I'd like to see more of. Given how porous or like how sensitive to potential adversarial attacks these companies' models are, there could be one of those cases where you can just keep showing every time that, like, hey, you're trying to create more powerful models, and you're saying you want to prevent certain uses of these models that could be harmful or like catastrophic in some way. Well, okay, just with a simple prompt engineering or simple way of finding a way to get into this model, okay, voila, people can just use this. So this is unacceptable. Like, this is unacceptable by your own standards.
Okay. So this is the fourth research plan that I wrote. I had 3 others that I investigated and decided, like, no, this isn't the direction to go for some reason or another. One of them was basically utilizing the model organisms argument. The post I am referencing is titled Model Organisms of Misalignment, The Case for a New Pillar of Alignment Research by Evan Hubinger, Nicholas Schieffer, Carson Dennison, and Ethan Perez. I mentioned this a little later, but to prevent confusion, I wanted to note it now as well. The research angle I am suggesting is not precisely the same as that of the model organisms paradigm as it is written in the Model Organisms of Misalignment post, but it was inspired by it. So this was beginning of August, people from Anthropic, and the idea was we should purposefully make misaligned models in scenarios where it's a clear box, like we can examine the workings of what's happening and why it's happening, and then we can apply alignment techniques to it and like test them. So like, and that's the purpose, to study why it happens and to test alignment techniques. The extension to that I had was, well, I feel like there might be a way to, just with fine-tuning models that we have out right now that say that they have safety measures in them, like Llama 2 says it has safety measures in it. I think we could fine-tune that, like, to not have those safety measures, and it still wouldn't be able to cause catastrophic risk on its own, but like it could still be used to potentially contribute to like the planning of a mass shooting or something like that, and like that would be dangerous enough. And so not only using, hey, here's how we trained it to show that it's already not aligned effectively, and like that process can then be examined more, but also use it as the like indicator of it's already not safe enough. And I think that more closely aligns with like your thoughts on it. I'm curious what you think about that project, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I feel some uncertainty here. It sounds good. There's some concern about if it becomes very flashy. It's like, hey, here are all the kind of bad things you can plan in this model. Then, maybe it can become counterproductive. But I do like the version of this that's basically like, hey, you guys, you're saying that your models could become so powerful and could do all of these kind of things, including risky things like this, aid in development of like killer pathogens. Okay, so you're expecting your models to become like that in the future. Okay, let's take a look at how your current models are right now, it's like they're not that generally functional. But it seems like people can quite easily just bypass anything that you have here and just start asking these questions. And not only that, like a bunch of other kind of harmful planning processes. Yeah, it's interesting because it feels like there's really two different projects here, like both of which feel valuable. For me, the idea of, okay, there should be restrictions in biolabs on the use of machine learning techniques that could easily be used, like misused for like trying to like optimize for or tinker for more deadly pathogens. I think that sounds super valuable. That sounds like the kind of thing that needs to be prevented for sure. And then there's the other side, which is just like, hey, there are these AI companies that are already talking about preventing the use of machine learning models to develop pathogens. And okay, let's use that efficacy and like turn that back onto the companies and whether they're actually
really examine the things that they're saying and the things that they're putting out and see if they match up.
Yeah. So to actually put them under scrutiny there, because otherwise it just, to me, I haven't looked into this much, but it feels like one of those things that can become a vague story. We're like, yeah, we need to do something once our models become more powerful. Like, yeah, we definitely should have some regulator, you know?
Yes. One of the key reasons that I dropped the model organisms idea was that I wasn't sure I would have capability to put enough safeguards on it. My worry was that, maybe I don't want to be doing this kind of fine tuning or this kind of research without being able to have a little bit more oversight and like cybersecurity or vetting process. So like maybe AI Safety Camp isn't the location to do this project in, but you're obviously more versed in that. So what would your thoughts be regarding those concerns?
I'm not a machine learning engineer, so I want to preface with that. I guess I can imagine harmful versions of the model organisms things, but it feels like what can be the case here, what seems quite likely, is that whatever advice that current large language models are going to give in terms of developing pathogens, if someone tried to replicate that, they wouldn't really get that much out of it. It can kind of make sense. So it's like, okay, yeah, I can see how someone who would want to develop a pathogen would do some of these things, or if they wanted to do some of these other things, they would do some of these other things. And then you basically just take these AI company people's argument, which is like, these models are going to be so much more powerful. They're going to be able to do all of these things, and say, okay, so then you shouldn't be allowed to scale these models, or like you shouldn't be allowed to make them that more powerful, because clearly you have a security problem here. Clearly, like, people are already able to do planning processes with the use of these models, and like, it's like, it seems to make some sense. And you're saying that kind of advice is going to be much more useful for bioterrorists in the future. So you haven't plugged the security gaps you have. So by your own claims or your own concerns, that you're not supposed to be allowed to continue with this. So that's a way to take it.
Yes. The question I have is, what about the company that explicitly doesn't care? Which relatively recently they released their LLM that the whole point is that it doesn't have any restrictions on it whatsoever.
Was it a French company or something?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I forget exactly what it was called, but
they just put out a torrent, which I felt like was like a horrible precedent to set. It's like, hey, here's a torrent to
No, they chose that on purpose because it would be impossible to take down.
Yeah, that's pretty horrible. It's like, oh, don't do that. It's not like I'm particularly concerned about that large language model, but it's just like, oh, just don't start working in that direction.
Well, I don't know. It's like right now I don't think it has the capability to do catastrophic risk kind of stuff, but I do think it has the capability to significantly assist in basically misuse cases. Like, you can ask it basically any question, like, how do I kill my wife and get away with it? And it'll tell you. If we're already there, and we've got a company that's willing to do that, then even if we can convince companies like Anthropic they should be doing more safety research, like, how do we address this other pseudo-malicious company?
So from my perspective, companies like Anthropic and OpenAI have actually, I think, been arguing against the use of open source models because they think it's too harmful. It's been a convenience, like an economically convenient argument for them to say, like, we're not going to release our model weights. So in that way, that case that can be launched against development and deployment of open source models as well, including, okay, these people can go to jail because they release these models, and these models could potentially be used in catastrophically kind of harmful ways, potentially down the line. So in that way, it can cut that way, and it can also cut against these AI companies that are saying that they care so much about how they could be misused.
I guess going back to the bioengineered pandemic risk question, my thought was like, well, I personally feel like there's already enough of an argument for these things. and we should be more thoroughly investigating that company that just released the torrent of their LLM. But that's not happening right now because there aren't any rules in place about it. And so maybe the first step is just to get those rules in place, and then the step after that is to leverage those rules and the current state of the more safe systems and show that they aren't meeting the standards set in that policy, or like soon wouldn't.
Yeah, but I also think in terms of setting the rules, there will need to be consensus. And I think there are some people who are like working towards getting bills passed here, but somehow consensus needs to be built. And for that, having useful examples would be valuable. That feels like that could make it a very different project. And I'm not sure if you actually want to go in that direction, by the way. I can imagine that you're like, I don't want to start having like a team of prompt engineers and like finding ways around to kind of get these models to take it.
No, I'd be interested in pursuing that angle as well. The thing that I wanted to do by applying to be a research lead was get some real experience, not only as a research lead, but also just like with researching machine learning stuff, whether that was more policy related or more technical related, and increase the number of people who can work on AI safety. Because like, I think that I'm not the greatest mentor, but for people who are relatively new, I can be one that's okay. And like, that's worthwhile to do. So I would definitely be interested in pivoting if we think that's going to be more valuable overall.
Yeah, right now I'm just airing thoughts. So I think it's worth checking this with other people as well and get a sense of this. It does feel like, yeah, there are 2 points I feel like that are currently could be refined more in terms of considerations. One is the point about specific ML capabilities. So we were talking about planning processes on one end, which can also refer to other kind of planning processes, like the use of these large language models to enable people to do harmful shit. But then there's also like, okay, you could have a biolab just training neural networks on existing biogenetic data. And there's something there like, where do you want to take this? Where maybe specializing in one or the other could be useful. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is like how to link it up to policy. Yeah, I do think having example. I think what I'm suggesting here might in some way be an easier route, because if you just have companies saying like, hey, we're concerned that as our models become so powerful, they'll be able to do all these things.
Right.
And so we need to deal with that. And then if you can just show that the current models, you can kind of do these planning processes, even though they're not really going to contribute that much, and like go through that with adversarial attacks, then it's like, okay, so how are you going to prevent all of these adversarial attacks in the future, given that you're saying that these models could be misused? So there's a way that kind of thing can contribute in the end to legislation around this as well.
Yeah.
And in a way that holds the companies accountable to what they're actually saying they care about. Like if they say they care about future risk.
Yeah, I think it's a slightly more defined theory of change than what I had initially thought.
But this is just one way, like this is what I'm coming up with in the moment.
Right.
And maybe there's another angle, a way to take this project. But yeah, there is some question around also things like high precision estimates of the probabilities of these kinds of things.
Yeah, so by precision, I just mean that we're not saying like 5 to 50% increase. So yeah, I'm using precision of like, we have a 95 or whatever percent confidence that it's within this relatively small like range. So it's at least understandable in the results. It's not just like, oh, we know it will be somewhere between two very far away numbers, was all I meant by that. I don't know if, even so, I don't know if that's quite possible, but it was the ambitious version.
My sense is that if you're going to have like some kind of mathematical model here, there's going to be soundness issues in terms of like, what are you actually modeling? And it can be very easy to have model error in terms of thinking that your model corresponds with something, but that's not really how reality works.
Yeah.
Like you're not really tracking politics. You're not really tracking all these capabilities and how they are used and combined by those actors with particular motivations. So it feels hard to really say something about like, hey, this is how much it increases the probability of X, but that's just how I'm thinking about it. Just from my outside view perspective, it feels quite loose, fidgety.
I guess my thought would be, could we get a lower bound on how much it increases? Basically, taking all the conservative assumptions that we can we get the amount that it increases the ease of being able to do it? This is how much work it reduces, how much easier it gets to do. That was my thought if I'm pursuing this project.
Yeah.
Because having that lower bound and saying, well, this is the lower bound and we don't know what the upper bound is, here you can look at all of our assumptions, and they are clearly the most conservative versions. Even so, it's still increasing.
It is interesting to me to consider that, like, this is just in my mind. This is incredibly simplistic. There's something like there is something around, hey, what's the initial bottlenecks for people who are aiming to destroy a bunch of stuff? Like, okay, there's something about planning processes, something about like just making it easier for these people to come to certain decisions. And then there's something around like, okay, what kind of devices do we need? How do we sequence DNA? How do we do CRISPR operations and stuff like that? So that feels like another bottleneck. It feels like those are like two things side by side, and there's a question: how much do you want to? Well, and then in between, maybe there's the thing that you mentioned before around like the use of machine learning to target changes to pathogens, or like allows you to kind of design specific pathogens with the use of all the other machinery to be more lethal in a more widespread way. So there's quite a lot of things there.
Yeah, and so my thought, part of like the value of the project and some of that initial work is understanding what those bottlenecks are. My intuition is that there are probably a couple more. Like those are the three that are the easiest to think of, but I think that there are probably a couple other places that you could say like, oh, machine learning would really help make this easier for someone that was a rogue actor.
Interesting.
And so that was, I guess it sort of makes the project more large scale than maybe what you were thinking, because it's looking at the whole process as opposed to one specific
Makes
thing.
sense.
I don't know if that changes your thoughts on it or not.
Yeah, I think that's clarifying. That makes sense. I think partly I was kind of unclear what was meant with specific ML capabilities, but I think I had a tendency to think about like current models, bigger companies. Yeah, I think there is a question about scoping in here that does feel like quite a challenge to do that rigorously across that entire chain. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I have a tendency to my eyes are bigger than my stomach for this kind of thing. Okay, we've talked about a lot, and I can think of one pretty significant pivot and then a couple other, I guess, more narrow versions of the project, or just like trying to rescope it so it's more doable. It seemed that you were most excited about the pivot. I think the way that you were thinking about it makes sense to me, and the theory of change for that project seems a little bit more robust than the theory of change for the version that's closer to what I have written up here.
Curious to hear about the other version as well, though.
Yeah, the other would be focusing on the more difficult bottlenecks in the process of like doing a bioterrorist attack, which would be research, design, and synthesis of bioengineered pandemics, and focusing on what the effect of machine learning on that would be. So that's, I guess, sort of like the other one. The third would just be to reframe the current version that's in this file so that it was more targeted and more succinct. My thought is that that may be able to be done through specifying explicitly what the capabilities are, basically doing some upfront research and then defining like, here are the ones that we're looking at and in what ways we're looking at them, and that might be enough to bring its scope down to something more doable. I don't know if that's true. Those are just the three different things that I've thought of so far.
I mean, for the third one, I guess I can imagine something like having a categorization, like here are the problems, like here are the potential capabilities applied to this R&D chain needed to create these pathogens. And like at the top, there is this thing around planning. And then after that, there's kind of research into what's needed to design this pathogen itself. And then there's like some kind of design and synthesis processes after that. That's also a potential project. So some kind of way of like just mapping out where machine learning could be used, and less than like, okay, and then we're going to have high precision estimates overall for machine learning. That feels quite hard for me.
I think that's valid. Someone the other day mentioned like maybe just start with, is it going to make it more likely, and focus on those. Later you can add in like by how much, but initially just what are the things that machine learning can contribute to this process.
Yeah, it feels like the what needs to be cataloged before you can even talk about like how much for that for the what. That makes sense to me.
The counter to that would potentially be, is the value add of this enough to warrant a well-researched document that has all of the different steps to make a bioengineered pathogen on it?
Yeah, that's a good point. In some way, you're also just saying like, hey, in some way, it can at least give people ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's part of the reason that it, I guess, got scoped to be like, oh, this is the likelihood, because if you could point to the number, it's more likely to get fire under the politicians. Whereas if you're just like, it becomes more likely, it's harder to get movement. And so that was part of the reason that I had that, was just like, it might not be worth it to just say, here are the ways that it would be made easier, because then you're explicitly saying, here are the bottlenecks in the process, and
Yeah.
here is the process.
Yeah, this makes sense. I do find it interesting how these AI companies, the way they've been talking about it, could be leveraged against them. So I personally find it exciting, but I also want to be careful that, like, this is just me coming up with ideas on the spot, and
Okay.
I wouldn't want you to anchor too much on it.
Well, okay, so
Yeah.
here's my thought then. What if I go back to the model organisms research plan that I have and rework it to more fit with what we're talking about? And then I'll share that with you
Interesting.
and let you know anything that I came across that might make it more difficult, because I found that, yeah, as I was writing these, you get to a point you're like, okay, that actually is going to be relatively tricky to do. And so just writing out like what you would need to do is really helpful. So I can point those out, and just having that as like a more fleshed out idea might be able to tell us what the potential positives and potential negatives are, and like whether or not this is viable.
Yeah. By the way, one thing that comes to mind here is, maybe it's not even a model. I haven't really properly read through this post yet, but maybe it's not even like the kind of model organisms where you're trying to precisely show how misalignment could occur in some kind of agentic version of this. But it's more like, hey, you guys are concerned about misuse. You're saying that
Yes.
your model can already do this. And like that's kind of bad. And then like you're saying, it's going to be much more powerful. So let's just assume that they're right, and the models are going to get much more powerful at all these things. And you can't prevent people from using it, because given like the attack surface, so you need to fix that.
The angle that I was thinking was, it's not quite model organisms. It just was inspired by that
Interesting.
post, but it's more like a demonstration of being able to, yeah, like use these models in a negative way, and being like, look, we fine-tuned this stuff away pretty easy. I definitely think that's possible for Llama 2 because it's fully open sourced. I don't know how possible that will be for the other models, because it does seem that at this point they do an okay job, or like a pretty good job, when you're just doing prompt engineering. Obviously it can still be gotten around, but it might be hard to fine tune that. We'll see. I mean, that'd be worth investigating.
But I think the main point is just whether you could use these models, right? So it doesn't really matter, like any way that people could attack these models in a way that hasn't been shown to be preventable in the future. Like whether it's fine tuning or prompt engineering. I guess like the point is just like, if these companies are saying that we're going to develop these powerful models, whether they're open source or any other case. Yeah, I guess there's a question there as well. Do you want to focus on open source models? I think that I can see the good angle there. Or do you want to focus on the companies, I think, that are having these closed models? I think both seem interesting in their own ways.
The open source to me seems like really tractable.
Interesting.
Like I just feel like it would be relatively easy to fine tune that away. The safety aspects of Llama 2 away from it, because we have the model.
Nice.
Like doing that as a first step might be better, because that'll help me build like my prompt engineering and fine tuning skills and get me more accustomed to that. Like working with a bigger model, and then also I think it'll be easier to do. And since that's still valuable, like another project after that could be extending that.
It makes a lot of sense. I've like a Machiavellian plot in my mind where you could even just get the AI companies, or people could get the AI companies on board with restricting the use of open source models, saying like, hey, this could be used for these kind of pathogens and things like that. And then they put all that effort on it, and then you just kind of turn it back on the AI companies after they've been supporting those initiatives to stop the use of open source models. Like, oh, well, what about your stuff? Apparently, we can still get into it. That feels quite interesting to me, actually.
And I think that angle, like that approach, is also definitely possible, because like OpenAI and Anthropic, at least publicly, are saying like, yeah, we want this. And so I do think they would probably jump on the opportunity to try to shut down fully open sourced models.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you want to, it looked like a lot of writing work, but if you want to create a new proposal, so just to be clear, I think what you've written here so far, I think it's pretty good. It just needs to be kind of narrowed down, I think, somewhat for a team to work on it for 3 months. But yeah, I will be excited to get your like a more specific project proposal on kind of showing how you can use these open source models and can fine tune them for misuse. That seems interesting to me.
I did look further into this, and I quickly found 3 resources which had all been published in the 2 weeks prior to this discussion. These were Shadow Alignment, The Ease of Subverting Safely Aligned Language Models by Yang et al., Fine-Tuning Aligned Language Models Compromises Safety Even When Users Do Not Intend to by Key et al., and a post to the AI Alignment Forum entitled Un-RLHF, Efficiently Undoing LLM Safeguards by Pranav Gade, Jeffrey Ladish, and Simon Lerman. I had mixed feelings about finding these sources. It is great that this research is getting done, and that I had been thinking about similar research questions to others that were being investigated by more experienced individuals. At the same time, I was disappointed, as it feels I don't have anything additional to contribute to this research. After this discovery, I returned to the proposal discussed in the episode and began working on refining it. Okay, well, awesome.
Yeah, it was good talking. Yeah, I valued the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It was very helpful. I've got a lot of ideas, so.
Yeah. And at the same time, do take some of my points with a grain of salt. Again, I'm not a machine learning engineer, and I am also not specialized in any way when it comes to pandemics or bioengineering. I'd be interested if you get other people to give their 2 cents on it as well.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand what you're saying, but at the same time, it felt to me like you didn't make any claims that I was not sure about. You know, like they all seem to make sense to me. So,
wishing you, I guess, a good day, and I'm gonna start making dinner.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much.
Bye.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for that discussion. Thank you all so much for listening and bearing with me as I get this whole podcast thing figured out. I have already learned a lot about ways to make this process more streamlined and effective for next time. At some point in the near future, I plan on having comments enabled on the Into AI Safety website, which is at into-ai-safety@github.io. But until then, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, counsel, or coupons, feel free to reach out to me via email at intoaisafety@gmail.com. Until next time. Yeah.